In many advanced countries such as the UK, the housing market is in many ways broken, with house prices out of the reach of many young people. Since 1997, the IFS report that house prices have increased by around 160%, and yet average incomes for people aged 25 to 35 has increased by only 19%. And this has led to house price affordability falling to the worst levels on record, with the average house price to earnings around 7 times income. How did we get into this state where housing is so expensive and taking up such a big percentage of young people's income? In this video, we'll look at all the different factors that have contributed to a broken housing market and what, if anything, can be done about it. So first of all, the big problem of the housing market is the imbalance between supply and demand. Demand has been rising for housing due to higher population, increase in number of households, but supply hasn't been keeping up. We simply can't build enough houses to meet the growing demand. And this leads to the expensive house prices and rents that we see today. Now, what's been causing the UK population growth? Well, one important factor since 97 is high levels of net migration. We've averaged around 200,000 net migration per year. And even the vote to leave the European Union in 2016 hasn't changed that, because although EU migration's gone down, non-EU migration has replaced it. But it's not just net migration that's increasing demand. We're also seeing a growth in the number of households faster than the population growth. Why is this happening? Well, we've got an increase in the number of single occupant households. More old people living alone, more single people, people divorced or separated. And this has caused quite a significant rise in the number of households, about 16% in the past 20 years or so. But an interesting thing is that because prices have been going up so much, that we've had an interesting trend in that more young people are not moving out of their parents, but continuing to live with them for purely economic reasons. And it's estimated around 3.5 million people under the age of 35 still with their parents. And this is primarily because housing is so expensive. Now, in a normal operating market, the rising demand for houses and rising prices would encourage an increase in supply. But this hasn't been happening. Supply is very inelastic and unresponsive to the demand that's been increasing. Why is this? Well, a big factor in the UK and also many other countries is the quite strict planning regulations. It's difficult to get permission to build on land, especially greenbelt land. And whilst from a national point of view, many people, especially politicians, talk about the need to build more housing, on a local level, there's often opposition. This is a NIMBY problem, not in my backyard. But there are understandable concerns because local people don't want to see their greenbelt land destroyed. They're concerned that if there's more houses built, public services won't keep up to meet the rising population. And the housing crisis has also been worsened because there's been a significant shift. People living in densely populated housing in inner cities. There's been a shift away to living in the suburbs, the countryside. So there's increased demand for wanting to live near greenbelt land. And this creates the tension between those who want to protect the countryside and those who want to live there. So one possible solution is to find a way to increase the housing stock on brownfield sites where there isn't so much local opposition to building houses. Another big factor behind the UK housing crisis is the change in the situation of council housing. If we go back to the post-war period after the Second World War, the UK also had a huge housing crisis. Many houses would be destroyed by bombing, and also other stock was in very poor condition. But the government in the post-war period made great effort to increase the supply of housing. And in some years they got close to building 500,000 houses per year. And these were good quality council housing, which were then rented out at low prices to the working population. And these council houses really helped to moderate price increases and to give affordable rentable accommodation to low-income workers. But in the 1980s, this all changes. First of all, many council houses were sold off to the inhabitants. And this was great for those who lived there because they were able to buy a house at a very cheap, discounted rate. But it's meant that the number of council houses for rent has fallen dramatically, and it means that many local authorities struggle to house those in desperate need, and this is a big factor behind the growth in homelessness in the UK in recent years. But also, another factor was that funding for council housing fell quite dramatically, and you can see how the number of council houses built really dwindled to very little. And some public funding went to housing associations, but you can see that the growth in building by housing associations has in no way compensated for the amount of council houses we used to build. So the private sector is constrained by planning regulations and difficulty getting land, and also the government sector is doing very little to build new houses where it's needed and for affordable accommodation. Now, in response to the growth in house prices and the fact that they're so unaffordable for many people, the government and parents have helped to, in a way, worsen the problem by trying to make it possible to buy a house even though it's very expensive. So, for example, in recent years, the government have had a Help to Buy initiative, which basically is giving young first-time buyers an extra government loan to be able to get a mortgage. So this is good for those who can now buy a house, but in a way it's inflating the problem because it's just increasing demand even further. Rather than trying to tackle the underlying shortage, it's just increasing demand further. So it's an ineffective way to solve a problem, but it was you could say, a short-term political fix. Another factor that's kept housing demand growing is that some parents have been quite generous in helping their children with a deposit. It's said that up to 60% of parents have given help to their children with a deposit averaging in the region of 30,000. So this is why some people have been able to buy a house even though the house price is many multiples of their income, because of this intergenerational lending. And this has further inflated the housing market and the demand. And it's why we're seeing this really record levels of house price to earnings ratios. But there's a very obvious problem, because it creates this sharp dividing line between those who can rely on the bank of mum and dad and those who can't. And it's increased wealth inequality very significantly. Young people who can inherit wealth or get help from their parents are able to squeeze themselves onto the property ladder. But those who aren't in that lucky position are really squeezed out, and they're left to deal with a very difficult and competitive rental sector where average rents have increased to over £1,000 a month, and in London over 2,000. Now, with all these factors we've talked about the shortage of supply, the housing market has been further fueled in the past 13-14 years by a period of ultra low interest rates. Interest rates across the developed world have been close to zero ever since the financial crisis. And this is great news for those who have a mortgage. It makes it very cheap to get one. And of course, it encourages many buy-to-let investors. The housing market has simply been a much better investment than the stock market or the bond market or keeping your money in the bank. With housing, you get capital growth and very good rental income. And the ultra-low interest rates have created this big increase in demand from buy-to-let investors, which have squeezed out people wanting to buy a home just for themselves. So with interest rates very low, it's magnified demand for the housing, but it's coming from these buy-to-let investors, people buying a second home. And in the UK, for example, nearly 900,000 English households have a second home, with 500,000 of these in the UK. So this is another factor that's increased demand for housing, with the wealthy able to buy a second one. Now, as I mentioned in a recent video about a possible housing price crash, this period of ultra low interest rates is coming to an end because high inflation is forcing central banks to increase interest rates. And this may have quite a big effect on the buy-to-let investors who now want to perhaps get out of the housing market before mortgage costs increase. And this could cause falling house prices. And this is another problem of the UK housing market. There is this inherent volatility that when interest rates are low and confidence is high, house prices can rise very rapidly, 10, 20, 30% a year. But when we get rising interest rates or the credit crunch of 2007, market conditions can change very quickly. And as house prices fall, this causes the buy-to-let investors to consider selling, and prices can fall quite a lot. So it's worth bearing in mind that there are two things going on at the same time. One is that house prices are very expensive because of all the shortage of supply and high demand. But even though there's this fundamental expensive house prices, it doesn't mean that house prices can't fall. You know, look at the past history. In the early 80s, house prices fell after rising interest rates. In the early 90s, they fell very rapidly because of rising interest rates. And after the financial crisis, there was a big fall in house prices. So we may be seeing another fall in house prices over the next 12 months. But in the long term, house prices will continue to be unaffordable unless we can really tackle this long-standing problem of a lack of housing supply compared to demand. And what problems does this broken housing market cause? Well, one of the biggest problems is a rise in homelessness because it's so expensive to rent and because there's so much competition to get a rental accommodation. People can easily find themselves homeless. And in the UK in recent decades, there's been a significant rise because of a shortage of council housing and a very competitive housing market. Secondly, this broken housing market is causing a lot of intergenerational inequality, with young people unable to get on a property ladder and having to pay very high rental income, big percentage of their income, feeling it's unfair that they don't have the opportunity to buy a house that was open to their parents and their grandparents. So it's kind of ironic that we've had all this economic growth in technology, growth in productivity. So living standards should be improving. And yet the most basic aspect of life, a good place to live, has become very expensive and forced people into poor quality rental accommodation. So if we could tackle the housing crisis and build more affordable homes, it would be one of the biggest ways to improve living standards, especially for the young people. And young people have it hard in many areas. They're leaving university with big student loans. There's a lot of job insecurity, and they face this cost of living crisis. And on top of that, the housing crisis. So some people have done very well out of the housing market. They've seen a big increase in their wealth, and that's enabled them to perhaps have a good lifestyle and even buy a second home. But the flip side of a coin is that young people face a really challenging situation. And the only solution really is to find a way to increase the supply of housing through both the private sector and also the public sector. And we shouldn't dismiss the concerns about building on greenbelt land. I think we all share a desire to protect the countryside and make sure that local communities are not swamped by new houses without the relevant public services. So there does need to be a real effort to find suitable brownfield sites or sites of high housing density which are good quality without causing too much loss of a greenbelt land, and finding ways to build houses but also make sure that the other services and infrastructure keeps up. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. I do recommend a recent video on the house price crash for another angle on the UK housing market. But if you like this video, do give it a thumbs up, and feel free to subscribe to this channel. And if you have any comments, feel free to leave one, and also leave any questions you might have.